I'm going to talk about this set of ideas, this set of concepts in this language. I think we need these words to think about the issues that are before us, particularly in relation to higher order thinking. Psychometric testing, for instance, is the statistical study of test performance, a branch of cognitive psychology. It has really two aspects. It has a procedural aspect, that is a psychometric way of doing things, and it has a set of psychometric constructs. One of the ideas that runs through what I'm going to say is the idea that the constructs that we test are not psychometric constructs. We test curriculum-related constructs, and that even though we use procedures which are psychometric, I could explain in detail what that means, but I'll leave it aside. I'm going to talk about the term higher order, and I'm going to explain those terms with a number of other ideas. Convergent reasoning, for instance, now which can be summarised as reasoning in which there's a correct answer. Plausible reasoning, that is reasoning in which someone has to produce a convincing answer. And generative thinking, that is where someone has to create an answer or offer a creative response. I also need to, for what I have to say, the terms closed and open questions, which I'm sure are familiar to you. The term metacognition will also be underpinning some of the things that I say. That term is not a particularly complicated one, although it sounds so. It actually amounts to no more than thinking about thinking. I think that the most important 20th century skill is actually thinking skill. It was the same skill that was important in 1980, and it'll be the same skill that's important in 1930. And it's a particular area in which our education systems have not been well developed. I've just written a paper, if you wish to consult it, on the teaching of critical thinking. And in that paper I talk about an idea that's quite important. That's the idea used particularly by Perkins and Richard, and that's the idea of thinking routines. The teaching of thinking routines is an important idea. I explain it in that paper if you wish to consult it. But I want to offer you this principle. Writing higher order thinking items is an art, not an algorithm. An art, not an algorithm. I'm going to talk rather unashamedly about a test that I've been working on for 25 years. It's called the ACT scaling test. I'm unashamedly going to suggest to you that it's a model for certain kinds of breadth and subtlety of test items. And if I wanted to point to anything that I wanted to call higher order, I want to call that battery a higher order test. It's used for scaling of school-based assessment in the ACT. You can see some information about it from that website. Very prominent in recent years. It's claimed commonly that educational assessments are too concerned with testing of recall and facts and information without demonstration of understanding. It's also commonly said that there's too little concern with the testing of the application of knowledge and too little concern with testing generic and higher order problem solving and critical thinking. I think there's a good deal to be said. That's a pretty legitimate set of criticisms of most exam systems that I've looked at. Then what is higher order thinking? I've used the definition offered by Lauren Resnick in the 1980s. It stands very well still, I think. The basic idea is that it's not recall of information. It's problems in which there are multiple solutions. It's problems that entail nuanced or subtle judgments and interpretations. It's the application of multiple criteria rather than a single criteria. It's thinking and reasoning in situations of uncertainty. It's self-regulation of the thinking processes. That's the ability to organise those thinking processes. And it's also interpretive in the sense that it entails imposing meaning, finding structure in apparent disorder. It entails effort. It's effortful thought. Right? Now that's the 1980s definition, and in fact it stands very well now in my feeling. This definition of critical thinking, though, higher order thinking, certainly poses a problem for us, though, particularly in terms of conventional assessment. It is a test construction challenge. In particular, the multiple choice test item seems at odds with, inimical, or unable to accommodate the kind of higher order thinking that I've just described, because such test items require a closed question and a correct answer. If you look back at those definitions I've just offered you from Lauren Resnick, you'll see that that kind of thinking is not that which is envisaged by her as higher order thinking. And it's worth remembering, of course, that most real thinking is not a discrete problem with a correct answer against three distractors. Testing plausible reasoning and generative thinking is a real challenge for test development. I need the terms convergent and generative to describe what I mean by higher order thinking. Generative thinking is constructive and productive thinking. It requires open questions, having answers conditioned by views and values, consonant with critical thinking, that's consistent with critical thinking, and entailing informal and plausible reasoning. That, according to, in my reading, Lauren Resnick, that's the definition of higher order thinking. And you have to see that definition as contrasted with convergent thinking. Convergent thinking is analytical or receptive thinking. It requires closed questions, having one or a limited number of correct answers, consonant with problem solving. That is, it assumes a problem for which there is a solution, whereas generative thinking doesn't assume a problem for which there is a solution. It's the only solution to that sort of problem is one which is optimal, or one which you judge according to various value criteria to be the best. Convergent thinking is formal reasoning and logico-deductive reasoning. Now that's a pretty clear contrast, I think, between generative and convergent thinking. And I'm suggesting to you that generative thinking is fundamental to higher order thinking. Now, we've taken this challenge of how do you produce test items that you can call higher order in the very narrow, closed framework of a multiple choice. And in doing so, we've come to describe them as plausible reasoning items. Plausible reasoning items rather than logico-deductive items. Such items are not, the answers to such items are not logically necessary or objectively and or empirically true. Okay? They're disputable. They're judgments. They're arguments. They're inferences and interpretations that are not logically irrefragable. They're not incontrovertible, unchallengeable. They're never, not just now, but never beyond dispute. Plausible reasoning items are strong inferences and interpretations. And in multiple choice items, we place them against implausible claims or inferences. So, what is plausible reasoning? I'll try to give a further definition by contrasting logical reasoning with plausible reasoning. Logical reasoning is formal, whereas plausible reasoning is informal. Logical reasoning presumes a correct answer, whereas plausible reasoning presumes a more or less convincing answer. Logical reasoning establishes a kind of truth, whereas plausible reasoning is rational. Logical reasoning is logically necessary in its conclusions, whereas plausible reasoning is a matter of value judgments and criteria. Logical reasoning has a logical necessity, whereas plausible reasoning entails value judgments. Logical reasoning lends itself to deduction, whereas plausible reasoning is a matter of inference. Logical reasoning is concerned with solutions. Plausible reasoning is concerned with interpretation. Logical reasoning is objective. Plausible reasoning is, in some sense or other, subjective. And what you'll see there is that clearly this interpretation of plausible reasoning is consonant with the kind of arguments that have been typical of postmodernism. In our view, plausible reasoning multiple choice items are a really significant and valuable diversification of what is usually the overwhelmingly logico-deductive and linear nature of most multiple choice testing. Almost by definition, it's logico-deductive and linear. But we've tried to get out of that, and what I hope to demonstrate in the rest of my comments is some of our attempts to do so. So I'm going to show you some plausible reasoning items, and that plausible reasoning item, those plausible reasonings are complex and subtle, although not necessarily difficult. And I think we should distinguish difficulty from higher order thinking. Higher order thinking is not necessarily any more difficult than other kinds of thinking. Plausible reasoning, as I've tried to outline it, is in my view what we mean by higher order thinking. Let me give you some examples. And they're examples from that test I spoke about before. Please look at this wonderful image. An image by the great cartoonist of the New Yorker, but more than a cartoonist, a great artist, in fact, called Saul Steinberg. I'll show you a number of his images. Here's the item. The image suggests that we cannot escape conformity, can effectively disguise ourselves, appear to be anonymous but are unique, appear to be unique but are anonymous. 62% of our Year 12 students in Australia, tertiary bound Year 12 students in Australia, can get that item correct. It's, as I hope you'll see, a quite unusually interpretive item. The curious thing, of course, is that the thumbprint is unique, is it not? But the curious thing is when you see it rendered in that fashion, inside a business suit, just as the face of a figure, it appears, in fact, to be extraordinarily anonymous, doesn't it? Hence, C is the key. Appear to be not anonymous, but are unique. Now, there's some quite lateral thinking entailed in deriving that answer, I believe. Yeah? It's not just done, I think, also by eliminating the alternatives. It's actually a strong interpretation of the impact of that image, in my view. If you look at that image, it has a kind of resonance, doesn't it? Because you see the figure there, but that figure is hidden, or seems to be hidden. Yeah? Another one. Same artist, Saul Steinberg. A quite remarkable image again. Inside the big speech bubble makes the word no. Huh? But inside the speech bubble is a whole lot of ornate longhand writing. You can't exactly read it, it really doesn't say anything, but you can see this ornate language within the speech bubble that says no. Well, what does that add up to? Which of the following best describes the response of the man behind the desk, that is, the man who's speaking? The language is blunt, but the meaning is obscure, mild, but the manner is aggressive, elaborate, but the meaning is plain, provocative, but the manner is conciliatory. Well, in one sense, the speech puzzle is very straightforward. It's unambiguous, isn't it? It says no. But inside that speech bubble is a great deal of language. One feels complicated, ornate, polite. Hence my answer would be the language used by the man behind the desk is elaborate, but the meaning is plain. No. It's a very polite no, isn't it? Yes? But it's nonetheless no. 58% of our Year 12, tertiary bound Year 12 students can get that correct. That's a subtle item too, I would have thought. I do think. Look at this one, a favourite of mine. My thoughts go home. The point of this cartoon is to suggest that women and men are able to ignore each other their faces are turned away from each other, are able to work cooperatively. They appear to be cooperating in some sense. Both support and are themselves supported, possibly. Both manipulate and are themselves manipulated. Well, I hope you can see that that is a picture of that curious paradox of marriage. We both manipulate and are manipulated. A very fine cartoon, of course, defying the kind of the physics of the situation. One marionette is holding up the other. Not possible, of course, but then you might say that the relationships between the sexes can seem impossible. Now, I hope you see what I'm trying to do with these items. Things, I can think of some of my colleagues who, if I used an image like that, would say, you can say anything you like about that. Well, our contention is you can't say anything you like about that. You can say some foolish things and you can say some very sharp and penetrating things. We hope that that's not only a strong interpretation, we certainly expect that none of the other interpretations that are offered of that cartoon in the item can be found to be plausible. And although we have always the caveat that someone may come along and give us a better answer than the one we've got. But that's the price you pay to do plausible reasoning in multiple choice test items. Been very few occasions where I've been embarrassed in that respect, but there have been a couple. I won't talk about them. That is where someone comes on after the event and says, oh, I can see why you thought it might be like that, but it's actually like this. And you go, oh, you're right. Yeah, that is right. I once did an item, went overseas, did some work, came back, saw it in a test about 6 months later and said, oh no, it's wrong. You know? Fortunately, no one took us to task on it, but that's the danger you run with doing test items of this kind. Critical thinking is also something we're particularly interested in, and critical thinking has a real problem with the multiple choice test item. And the reason is because critical thinking doesn't presume a closed question and a necessary answer. In my view, it isn't critical thinking if it's a closed question with a definite answer. I'd offer you that by definition. We've struggled with this. I've been working on this business for 26 years, struggling with this idea, how do you do critical thinking in a test which is multiple choice? Well, these are one of the formulas. We have a number, but one of the formulas we've come to use. Our paradigm for critical thinking is the debate. Certainly the debate as done formally in Australia. I believe it's true for many other cultures also. That's the debate in which there's a proposition put up and there are two sides who argue one side arguing for, the other side arguing against. The formal debate. Now, derived from that is this kind of test item. It's a test item in which there's a proposition. Violent TV and videos contribute to real-life violence. There's the proposition for debate. And what we do is offer a series of statements to the candidates, and we ask them to classify according to the key of A, B, C and D there. That is, we ask them to classify them as most likely part of the debate for the topic or part of the debate against the topic, or more difficult, possibly part of the debate for or against the topic, or D, not relevant to debate for or against the topic. So we're asking them to classify them according to that key. Now, what in effect we're doing is asking candidates to imagine a debate between two sides. We take a statement, and then we're asking the candidates to imagine it as part of an argument. Right? They have to extend it to become part of an argument. Let me show you such an item. Question 1 there. People easily separate fantasy from reality. They easily separate fantasy from reality. Now, this, if that is true, and we accept for this purpose that it is true, what it means in relation to the proposition is that the kind of violence and videos violent videos that are seen in various kinds of contexts need not have an impact, can be separated from reality in terms of the audience. So clearly that is a potential statement against the topic for the debate. Now we'll do a number of such statements. Violence is never an acceptable course of action. Well, that's a really hard one, isn't it? Violence is never an acceptable course of action. It's about violence, but it's not about the impact of violence as a result of videos. Hence, our argument is that that's D rather than any of the other alternatives. Now, that's our struggle to do critical thinking within a multiple choice format. It's difficult and limited, in my view, to do such things, but that's the best we can get. It's in fact very difficult to do critical thinking within multiple choice. I'm going to talk about two other aspects of this battery, though, that I think are the much more clearly higher order aspects of this test. The first is the writing test, and that writing test is we call a process writing test in the idiom of the 1980s, and it has what we call a questionless question. The other aspect of this battery of tests I'm going to talk about are the short answer questions, in particular those short answer questions that we describe as archetypal. This is the stimulus material from a version of the writing test for this battery. It's a very unusual writing test, and I think, as far as I know, if someone could tell me otherwise, I'd be grateful. This, I think, writing test is unique. Students are instructed to write 600 words, but they're given 2.5 hours to do so, which is a very generous amount of time. They're instructed, in fact, to write a draft and to then redraft it in the 2.5 hours available to them. They incidentally aren't allowed out of the room for 2.5 hours. These are the instructions they're given. Am I setting this on? My magnetic power. Read carefully the material on these 2 pages. Write an essay of about 600 words giving your point of view on a major issue raised in the material. Give your essay a clear answer. You should assume you're writing to an intelligent adult audience. That's all the instruction they're given. No question, no task, make something. That's a process writing test because it's so little in such a long time, and it's a questionless question because there is no specific task given to the candidates. They have to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. In that sense, I'd argue that it's a higher order thinking task. And it's different, and you would be surprised, I think, if you look internationally at writing tests, of how many of them are converging. That is, how many of the writing tests say, we want you to do like this because we told you to, and if you don't do it, we will score you down. For my part, I think that's not really what a writing test should do. That writing test was created, the first administration of this test was 1974. The writing test was added in 1984, and the short answer questions were added in 2004. And I'm going to say something about them. They differ from the other aspects. The multiple choice tests in this battery are developed by finding a rich piece of stimulus and then asking unique questions about that stimulus, questions that are unique to that stimulus. It's stimulus-based testing with unique questions. There is no algorithm to that kind of writing. But when we came to design a short answer question test for our client, we thought about things differently. In particular, they were pleased at the extent and the impact that the writing test had on their students. And they wished us to try and find some way of encouraging critical thinking through our short answer question test. That meant we had to think about the test quite differently from the way we thought about the multiple choice. I think there's very limited value in attempting, other than preparing and familiarising, preparing kids for a multiple choice test of the kind we write. The items are unique and you can't anticipate what they are. You have to be able to develop a kind of flexibility of mind in the candidates. But if we were going to make a teachable short answer question test, we had to think about it differently. Our intention was to create a broad and general test rather than a specific item-specific set of test items. We wanted to challenge candidates to identify issues and find problems. We wanted the test to be open in that there need not be a correct answer, and we wanted to involve analysing and critiquing the things that are so difficult to do in the multiple choice test, as well as logico-deductive thinking and information processing. We wanted the test, the short answer questions, to involve options and the development of arguments. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Our intention was to create a test that was aligned with the curriculum, or in a sense represented a kind of curriculum, and we wanted that short answer question test to be teachable. Our method of approaching that challenge was to come up with what we've called archetypical questions, that is, standardised, kind of algorithmic, common questions. And what we do with these, this is a format that showed some of our initial thinking, what we do with these questions is that students are sitting this test on next Tuesday. What they'll know is at least half of the questions were on the test of the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that, and the year before that. Right? Exactly the same question. What changes, though, is the stimulus material they have to deal with in answering that question. This is only true of half of the test, but nonetheless, it's one of the things we do. So we give them an image like this. This worked very well. And it's a great deal of fun reading what intelligent students make of these kinds of images. And we ask a question. What impressions are we given by the drawing on the opposite page? What is suggested by the drawing? Your response will be judged on the accuracy of the description and understanding of the material and the substance and quality of the interpretation offered. That was the first year, 2004. We used this image. Reminds me of downtown KL. Yeah? Look at the old man sorrowfully sitting there looking at the little sprig of weed growing out from the crack in the contract. Yeah? Exactly the same question is asked. Exactly the same. Even by the second year, we began to see that the students were more comfortable. Yeah? Some students in the first year simply wrote something literal. It's an old man sitting on a bench and there are a lot of skyscrapers around. Thank you very much. Well, that kind of literal response became less and less common, so that it's now not to be found practically. The reason is because the students are prepared for this test. They know what they're seeing. They've done items of this kind, not only practice tests, they've done it in other things. Here's another great Steinberg drawing. Exactly the same question in the third year of the test. This was a slight variant. This is a very wonderful piece of stimulus. This is one that was made the heart glad. The top is the Manet picture of the Folies Bergère in the Courtauld in London. The bottom is the great artist of my hometown, Melbourne, John Brack, and it's his response to the Manet painting about 100 years after the Manet painting was done. And we asked the candidates to compare those two paintings. What impression are we given by each painting? And we asked them to contrast them. We got some wonderful discussion. And in particular, this great classic image and the Melbourne version of it, my hometown version of it, which you can see this in the gallery there, is by no means embarrassed by the comparison. This rather tough old lady barmaid is not kind of intimidated by her patrons in the way that that poor young lady of the Folie Bergère was. And John Brack, the Melbourne painter, was celebrating something about that tough Melbourne barmaid. And Jim will know the 6 o'clock swill there shown in the background, yeah? Another one by Cobb. We use this one. What's this mean? This beauty, what does this mean? Same question. Now our intention was that if we kept the questions steady, the teachers could find images of their own which they could put into them, that they could talk through. They could even use the formula for various kinds. They can use it in history, they can use it in English and so on. Incidentally, visual interpretation is getting much stronger in literature and English classrooms these days. But they have to come up, and the argument goes that literature in English is actually about interpretation, right? And that's what fundamentally the skill that's being developed is. This one went very well. Very interesting discussion of gender issues. We can adapt it to an advertisement like this. This one we adapted a little. This is an advertisement for a drink called Red Bull on the opposite page. What is suggested by the text and the image? How do the text and the image attempt to influence the reader, the viewer? That was a little bit disappointing, actually. More kids thought it looked like a picture of good fun than a manipulative image, I'm afraid. But it's not only, I've used those kind of images because they're easy to show at this stage, but we use a lot of straight graphical tabular material, but we don't treat it in the manner of our own multiple choice the way that tabular graphical material is genuinely treated in tests. In fact, the distinctive characteristic of the way we treat that material is that we ask global rather than specific questions. When you ask a multiple choice question, it's going to be specific. But when you ask the kind of question we're looking for, it's going to be global. So the recurring question for tabular graphical material is, what's worth interpreting in this data? What is there here? Find what it is that's significant. Now that's, I think, the fundamental tabular graphical question. And it's very difficult to do in a multiple choice. But it's it's very comfortable in a short answer question. It poses some problems in marking, but our experience has been, now this is counterintuitive, but our experience is the more specific the marking scheme, the more likely you are to get into trouble. All right? If you've got a global marking scheme operating at quite a high level of generality and a number of marks to distribute, you can get really quite consistent assessment of the student. I know that's counterintuitive. So a question for that material said, compare and contrast the following graphs in the table about what are the main points suggested by a comparison of the graphs. Okay? Again, we're doing comparison and contrast. Your comments will be judged on the accuracy, selectivity, significance of the interpretation you make of the graphs. Very general question. And there are 4 marks out of 25 distributed for that question. We expect them to write for 8 to 10 minutes on that. So it's really not a short answer question at all. As some people say about our short answer question, it's got a lot of long answers in it. All right? So we are looking for, in fact, our short answer question test will have about 20 questions in it. About 6 to 8 will be 1 or 2 marks. The others will be 3 and 4 marks. Yeah? So they're really quite substantial. The other distinctive thing about this test is the only test I know in which marking is done by a cross-curricular team. That is, we have math science people and we have humanities people marking exactly the same material. Right? And a marker begins at the beginning of the test and works their way through to the end. We usually have a math science person and a humanities person marking each thing, but we expect the math science people to mark the images I showed you before, and we expect the humanities people to mark the tabular graphical material. Our experience has been, unfortunately, and I say this as a humanities people, that the humanities markers are much less adaptable. They don't like having to make the kind of judgments entailed in a graphical item like that. The maths science people we've found are really quite comfortable about moving into things which are quite unfamiliar for their teaching background. I laughed yesterday when I saw the top of those diagrams last night. In fact, these are 3 diagrams of problem solving. They're quite different diagrams. And we say to the candidates, the diagrams, we've done this about 5 times now, the diagrams below are identified of different views of the activity of problem solving in this case, and they were offered to candidates with the following question. Compare and contrast how the diagrams present problem solving and what the diagrams suggest about that activity. Your responses will be judged on the accuracy of the description, understanding of the material, substance and quality of the interpretation offered. Again, a global mark of 4 out of 25. This is part of a new characteristic of testing, I believe, which is much more emphasis on visual interpretation in general and diagrams in particular. Our students are quite good at diagrams, but not as good as you would expect. They're very good at the other more impressionistic interpretations, but they're still struggling, I think, with many diagrams. So we keep repeating questions like that. There's one coming off on Tuesday, very much like that, just a completely different issue rendered by a set of diagrams. And they're asked to say how they're different. You can see clear differences, can't you, by the recursive nature of the top diagram, the linear nature with a certain kind of recursiveness in the middle one, and the serpentine, snake-like waving of the bottom diagram. Clearly different. We can take quite complicated maths and ask candidates to compare and contrast the sort of information in them. We also do straight numerical kind of calculations. This one was a fictional index created by a journalist for assessing the safety record of various retailers. And he constructed an index with some averaging and other kinds of things. We asked some pretty straightforward questions, you know, is a lower or higher combined index number a better outcome for the retail clothing chain? Straight yes or no, really. Explain the entry in the brown-coloured cell at the bottom of the table. I never understood that answer, but you've got to go with it. They tell me it's right. Apparently the answer's infinity, but I never knew. Anyway, but the next question is the one which I think is really interesting from our point of view. And it's what we call, and are very proud to call, critical numeracy. And what the question says is, how useful is the index idea as a way of assessing the retail clothing chains? In fact, it's a pretty crude index. And we're looking for an answer from the kids that says it's pretty crude. Now, that is, I think, a kind of level of critical numeracy and interest in numeracy that we are actively cultivating. Not just work out the right answer. What do you think of this procedure? Is this result worth having? How strong is this result? So, these are the words I've been thinking about. Psychometric testing. Remember, I'm talking about a test that's developed on psychometric principles, but is not developed on psychometric constructs. I've been trying to define higher order thinking using the terms convergent reasoning, plausible reasoning, and generative thinking. And I've seen all of those terms, higher order thinking, convergent, plausible, and generative thinking, as related to the questions of closed and open questions. Yes? That's what I'm trying to say. Now, what we're attempting to do is test generative as well as convergent thinking. About half the test, as I said, is convergent, the short answer question test, and about half is open-ended questions that entail generative thinking. What we're looking for in the test is a judicial balance of convergent and generative thinking. Incidentally, the test has been extraordinarily successful in its ability to predict performance in school subjects. It's actually the largest component of 2 multiple choice components, the writing test. The short answer question is now the highest predictor of performance in college subjects. And I think one of the reasons why that's the case is that they're actually higher order and in that sense more demanding. And it's very difficult for a student to have half their attention on the test and do well in that test. It's very difficult. It's easy for some kids to do well on a writing test because they have the kind of skill, but there's no way of easily doing the short answer question test. As the candidates have said in feedback we've got from them, we actually force them to think. And if they don't, they perform badly. This evening, there's a workshop we're doing, on higher order thinking. Now, what I thought was, and I understood that PISA is very important in your system, and I'm not surprised, it's extremely important in Europe at the moment, surprisingly so. Caused a revolution in assessment in Germany, for instance. What I thought we'd do in the workshop is have a look at the sample questions from PISA. There are 3 sets. There's reading, there's maths, and there's science. And what we've had is had those 3 sets of items duplicated. And what I'd like you to do is to choose one or other of those sets of items in anticipation of a discussion with other people of that same set of items this evening. Right? They will be available, I understand, later. It'd be good if you would have a look at those items, one or other of those groups of items, in preparation for a discussion this evening with other people. What we want to discuss are these questions. Which is the best piece of stimulus material in the group and why? Which is the worst question? Why? Which is the best question? And not all questions in these PISA sample answers are perfect. In fact, I think some of them are arguable. What question should have been asked but wasn't? Yes? That's a really interesting question. I had another way of doing this workshop, which was to give you the stimulus material and then ask you to write questions and between now and the end and this evening, and then see what questions you'd write in comparison with those written by the PISA writers. I think you're going to find that piece of material very interesting. I don't think with 2 hours we can afford to explore, first of all, what you'd write and then what PISA wrote, but I do want you to critique the PISA material. And what we're looking for is what are the criteria that we'll use for assessing the quality of this PISA test material? Right? Which questions, in particular, would we judge to be higher order and which are not? So I want to think about those PISA sample items in that framework. In particular, I want you to gain an understanding of the way in which PISA has approached the testing activity. I think you'll find those test items very interesting. I think you'll find some of them quite surprising. I remember when they were written, but I wasn't involved in them. I didn't actually have anything to do with them. When I came to read them, I was very surprised at some of them. And I think you'll have reason to be surprised also. So there are some 20 questions in the 3 test sets of samples. This, for instance, this food web comes from the math science test, from the science test. This very interesting diagram, I understand, I learned from PISA samples that this is a shell graph. Yeah? Very interesting. This actually comes from the reading section. It's about, I don't know whether you know, the waggle dance of the bees, how they indicate direction. Very complicated little text. And this is the first item of the PISA reading, which I'd like just to have a look at. It's headed "In Poor Taste" from Arnold Jago. It's a letter to the editor. Did you know that in 1996 we spent almost the same amount on chocolate as our government spent on overseas aid to help the poor? Could there be something wrong with our priorities? What are you going to do about it? Yes, you. self-righteous Arnold Jago from Mildura. Now that's quite a complicated little text, isn't it? This is the first of the reading items. And as you can imagine, it's anything but literal comprehension that's going to be asked about this little text, isn't it? You'll have a look at the questions. I think you'll find them interesting. I'd also suggest to you that they by no means exhausted the possibilities of that intriguing little text. And one of the things that would be interesting is I'd be interested in knowing whether, from your perspective, that's very much a kind of Australian text, isn't it? You know, that kind of letter to the editor is very sort of archetypal, isn't it? I wonder what it means when, remember, that text is going to be translated into 40-something languages and is going to be used across the whole of the world, right? I wonder how it stands up. And I wonder what it looks like from a Malaysian perspective. I had the experience 2011, 2012, I'm working on the new piece which is called A Hello, and I produced a multiple choice test for A Hello. It went to 17 countries. It's extraordinary how difficult it is to write test items that are going to stand up in translation into 17 different languages. It was certainly a learning experience. And to my surprise, test items that were taken from the test I was talking about before and adapted for that purpose actually worked really quite well internationally. So what the conclusion, incidentally, from that study is that you can test generic thinking skills across cultures at the end of tertiary education. Perhaps one of the other things that was amazing to me when I looked at this set of items was the unit on bullying. I wonder how this travels cross-culturally too. And the extraordinary thing about this for me was the fact that the second half of the passage, after some very complicated stuff about what teachers know, what parents know, what kids will tell both teachers and parents, some quite complicated material. The second half of the passage is a question about the narrative of a Japanese student who committed suicide as a result of bullying. I was very surprised by that question, and by that material in the text. And the question was asked: why does the article mention the death of Kiyocheru Oichi? And that's the answer. To explain why the survey was conducted, to give background to why people are so concerned about bullying in Japan. He was a boy who committed suicide because of bullying. To show how much bullying, how far bullying can go, it was an extreme case. Now, students who offered those answers got a score of 1. Those who offered vague or inaccurate answers, including suggestions that the mention of the young man is sensationalist, got 0. I think that a quite remarkable item. And something really worth thinking about in terms of the kind of latitude that that test has been attempting to do. It is pushing a number of boundaries, I think. Okay, I hope you will indeed read the material in preparation for the workshop tonight. I'm sure that you'll find it interesting if you do so. I look forward to giving you my answers to the questions that I've posed after you've given me yours. So, terima kasih.
Thank you, Dr. Doug McCurry.